Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Ask Kati Anything. I'm your host, licensed marriage and family therapist, Kati Morton. I'm so glad that you're here. Today we have the pleasure of sitting down with a good friend of mine, Kody Green. Now Kody, I'm going to read his bio because it's very important. Kody he has a diagnosis of undifferentiated schizophrenia, and he's a motivational speaker and content creator with over 1 million followers on TikTok. His stuff is so great. You've got to check him out. But he has struggled in the past with drug addiction, incarceration, and serious mental health issues. In order to be a better advocate and speaker, Kody has been trained as a peer support specialist, recovery coach, and suicide prevention specialist. Now, Kody shares his stories about his struggles and how to navigate through recovery, mental health issues, and life after incarceration. He chooses to pursue motivational speaking and mental health advocacy for schizophrenia awareness, drug recovery, and second chance opportunities because he has dealt with these struggles in his own life. Huge shout out and thank you to Kody for sitting down with us and sharing his insights and his process as he navigates being diagnosed with schizophrenia, having mental health issues in his family, incarceration, and everything we just talked about. So welcome, Kody. Let's just jump right into it. I always like to start off by talking about kind of our first introductions to mental illness, because even personally, I don't think I even became aware of mental illness until, well, probably earlier than a lot of people, but still later in my life. I think I was like in my late teens, maybe early 20s when I truly understood what that meant. So what was your first introduction to mental illness, and did you know what it was at first?
I would say that mine was very similar to yours. I later in life kind of figured it out also as a teenager when my mom first started having symptoms of schizophrenia. So my mom is officially diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder. She went undiagnosed for a very long time and misdiagnosed. And so my first introduction to mental illness was watching her struggle. And we lived in a small rural area, so there wasn't a lot of resources. There wasn't a lot of answers to what she was going through. And unfortunately, it would take a couple years after her diagnosis for me to get all of the information and have a better understanding to not only what schizophrenia was, but what mental illness was in general.
Yeah, and I can't imagine, especially because I know schizoaffective, for people out there who aren't familiar, it is essentially schizophrenia with a mood disorder. So that means it can come along with depression and come along with bipolar disorder, and it is often misdiagnosed. What we think it's something else because it comes along with a mood disorder. A lot of people think it's major depressive disorder or they have bipolar disorder without realizing that it also has some psychotic features that come along with it too. How did growing up, out of curiosity, with a parent who was struggling with a mental illness, how do you think that affected you or maybe your growth as a child?
Well, it definitely changed my outlook on the world and what I thought about people with mental illness and people with addiction. My mom was someone who, despite having a mental illness, was a very good mother. And it always confused me because people would act like she was dangerous in some way or like she didn't have the capabilities to take care of us. And she definitely struggled day to day, and there were good days and bad days. But overall, to me, it was very obvious she was confused, she was scared, and people didn't really understand what she was going through. No one really made an effort to. And so I saw very early on the stigma surrounding schizophrenia. And then once she got her diagnosis and treatment, I saw the stigma around medication. And so I think the way it affected me the most was it definitely impacted how I saw other people viewing mental illness and schizophrenia, how I saw immediately the stigma that surrounded it. So that probably played a huge role in my getting my diagnosis and being too afraid to seek help because of how people looked at schizophrenia and mental illness in our area.
Yeah, unfortunately, there is a lot of stigma, especially with, diagnoses like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. I see a lot of that as well. And just people always thinking that it's dangerous, when I love that you brought up the fact that she was actually confused and scared, because I think that's one of the things that I would say for most of the schizophrenic patients I've treated over the years, there's more research to prove this now, but one of my old mentors used to say that almost everybody with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, either currently or in the past, has struggled with depression, because once you recognize that something's off, what are you supposed to do with that? And he's like, and they feel scared, and people aren't always receptive to getting them help. There's a lot that comes along with it. And unfortunately, our media perpetuates those things all the time and makes me so pissed off. But yeah. So when you talked about your diagnosis and getting that, what were the first signs? And I know you said that it made you more reluctant to get help, but were you like, when you first had those first few symptoms, did you kind of like, no, this can't be happening? Was there any kind of like pushback, I guess, or internal, discomfort?
I would say I didn't really notice anything until later on, because when my symptoms first started, I was very delusional. I didn't really understand there was anything wrong with me. And so early on, it started with paranoia, from what I'm told from the people that were in my life at that point. It started with paranoia and very quickly led to delusions and auditory and visual hallucinations. And so from what I've gathered, just from my wife and my mom who were with me at the time, I didn't really understand that I was struggling with schizophrenia. So it wasn't until later on that I would kind of push back on getting treatment or getting help. But when it first began, I was very delusional. I didn't understand that something was wrong with me. I actually thought for a little bit that I was gaining some sort of ability to hear the thoughts of people around me. So because I had this delusion, I didn't think that I needed medication. I didn't think I had schizophrenia. I actually thought it was some sort of gift at first. And so that's why I didn't feel like I needed to seek help. And it wasn't until a few years of struggling with addiction as a way to cope and, listening to the people around me that I would have some like moments of clarity where I realized that maybe something was wrong. And even at that point, I didn't recognize it was schizophrenia. And when I started having these moments of clarity, I think I would have gotten help a lot sooner. But there was that stigma that I was very aware of, and I didn't want to be the kid with the label of schizophrenia, and I didn't want to be, the college kid on 6 different medications like my mom. And so in those moments where I did recognize what was going on, I refused to go in and get any help, which is what led to my long-term addiction and eventually my incarceration.
Gotcha. And how long did it take from when you finally did like admit it, try to get help, to become like, I don't want to say recovered, but in the psych world, we call it like stabilized, like where you feel like you can manage it? Did it take, because I know even in my community, people with any like depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, anything, it can take a while to find a medication that works for you without terrible side effects.
Yeah, I would say that fortunately, I started having success with the very first antipsychotic that I tried. I didn't stick with it long term. So it did come with some side effects, but I was having immediate clarity, and the delusions and paranoia went away almost completely. And now I really only struggle with auditory and visual hallucinations seldomly. So I was having success right away with antipsychotic medication. We did, alter it. We changed it a few times, but I was also really lucky that my diagnosis process and my treatment process went very quickly because of my mom's diagnosis. Obviously doctors are aware there's a genetic component to disorders like schizophrenia. So it was a little bit easier, I think, for me to get my diagnosis after her having to go through all of her issues with, medical teams and trying to get her medication and treatment. For me, it was a lot more streamlined. And so that definitely made it a lot easier. And then I think, psychiatrists and everyone talk about this all the time. The early access to medication played a huge role, I think, in my cognitive abilities and my ability to become more stable quicker.
Yeah, no, and I mean, we know through research and even just what I was taught in school, which now it's getting more and more in the past here, I'm getting older, but we do know that early treatment, early like diagnosing can limit, well, not even limit, it just makes the recovery process much smoother. And it means that, like you said, cognitively, there's honestly, like, no, if people met you, they would never know. Like, there's no real issue when it comes to your ability to function in your life. And that's why I always tell people, like, the sooner we reach out, the sooner we speak up, the better. It's almost like I always want to compare mental illness to physical illness because it's the same. And in a physical illness, like if I have a cold and I don't go to the doctor and I wait till it becomes pneumonia, well, it's going to be a bigger deal, and it's going to take a longer for me to feel, normal. So, and the same goes for our mental health. If we let ourselves stay in our depression or in our schizophrenic symptoms for a longer period of time, it's almost like the paths in our brain that cause delusions, hallucinations is stronger and harder for us to jump out of it. And I know you said that you sometimes have hallucinations still.
Yeah.
Are those triggered? Are they happening randomly? Because I know a lot of people wonder, like, well, once you're stabilized, then you just never have the symptoms anymore? And I'm always like, not quite.
No, and that's something that was, difficult when I was getting medication. It was working. It was really frustrating because I guess I did kind of expect, like, a cure-all. There was never that communication with doctors and psychiatrists to me that, like, hey, even with antipsychotics, you might get to a point of stability, but still have occasional symptoms. And so I guess I was under the same impression, like, hey, I got medication now, everything's going to kind of go back to normal. And there still definitely are negative cognitive and positive symptoms now. And mostly what I deal with is just those auditory and visual hallucinations. And I also want to stress to people, because people will always ask online, and, with social media being the place where I advocate, there's anonymity. So people will ask, insane questions and rude questions all the time. But one of the most common questions I get is, well, if you're still having symptoms, why take medication at all? And I don't think people realize the severity of how I used to go through symptoms versus what I experience now. So like I said, delusions and paranoia are almost non-existent for me. And if you talk to people with schizophrenia, in my opinion, those are the toughest symptoms to live with, because how do you function day to day if you can't trust your literal surroundings and the things happening around you? And there's still a little bit of that comes with auditory and visual hallucinations, but I went from hallucinating constantly. And when I say that, I think people assume I'm exaggerating. If I was awake, I was having hallucinations. I was having, some sort of delusion or, paranoia. So with medication now, especially recently, I transitioned to even more effective medication. And I probably have hallucinations once a week, once every other week for a few hours at a time. I just call them episodes now. And so like that's literally went from, my entire daily life to a few times, a month I deal with, positive symptoms. And so it's been a huge change for me. And it's hard to, quantify that for people who have never experienced symptoms like this. Because I understand the idea of like, well, if you're still having symptoms, clearly the medication isn't working. And so I think that became a big part of my advocacy, is helping people better understand not only schizophrenia, but medication and treatment that comes along with it.
Yeah. And I think for a lot of people, I would assume it's hard for them to imagine what that's like. When we don't experience something, I love that you brought up, like, it's hard to function if I don't trust anybody. And I will tell you that paranoia in my patients, it means they won't come to see me. They won't take their medicine, even if they're on it, because they think that that's how someone's trying to poison them. Or I had a patient that swore it was like a computer chip so that the CIA could track them, right? And there's because, and this is another piece that it's hard for people to understand. And I'm not saying that I know firsthand, but I at least understand it, that if you believe that, you have to understand the connection of delusions to paranoia, where if I believe that people are watching me or things aren't safe, that delusion, no matter what evidence, no matter what conversations you have, no matter who tells you, no, you're fine, you don't believe it.
Yeah, and exactly.
I think that piece is like really important for people to understand. And if that's happening like 99% of your day, 100% of your day, how are you supposed to have a job, have relationships? You frankly can't. And so
no, exactly.
I'm glad that you've gotten pretty much, not full resolution of your symptoms, but a million times better. And without any detrimental side effects, it sounds like, because I don't think you're very, like, I've had patients who are blunted and meaning like their affect is very flat. And I haven't noticed that in you at all. I feel like I've seen you for many times over the course, and it always seems like fine, right? You feel
Yeah.
comfortable with the way it is.
No, absolutely. That is one thing I will say with my journey through medication and treatment. I'm very lucky that because I communicate effectively to my care team, including my psychiatrist, one of the things we worked on was finding medication that would work with me that would still allow me to have, a cognitive clearance a little bit, like cognitive clarity. And so that was something where I did get to a point where I was on medication that was giving me almost 100% symptom relief, but it was clouding me so much that I didn't feel like myself. And so that's one of the things I always tell people: if you have an effective relationship with your care team or your psychiatrist who's prescribing your meds, you can have those conversations and they'll advise you, if they think it's a good idea or not. My psychiatrist saw that I was, taking my medication every single day and I was, doing really well on it. And I wanted to keep going with it, but I couldn't get past this cloud that was over me. And so we talked more about it. We kind of worked with my medication just to get it to a point where, I might have a few more symptoms, than I would if I was on this higher dosage. But it gave me a lot of that ability to communicate effectively and articulate my thoughts, which, as for an advocate and motivational speaker, that was really important to me, for someone trying to educate people more about schizophrenia and mental illness.
Yeah, and I think that's a big piece to treatment, right? Is being able to speak up to what's important for you. I know some people get embarrassed, especially in the SSRI, SNRI, like antidepressant realm. People will be afraid to tell their doctor, well, now I have sexual dysfunction, and that's embarrassing. And, we need to be able to speak about the symptoms that are upsetting, because it's our life. And I want everybody out there to feel comfortable with the level of treatment you're receiving. Like, to your point, Kody, like, I needed to have clarity of thought. And sure, I could get rid of all of my symptoms, but then I lost that clarity. And so I'm okay with a little bit, as long as, it's a give and take, because unfortunately nothing's perfect and the brain is still yet to be fully understood, and all of the operations and treatments keep getting better. But we, make sure that you speak up. For anybody listening, like, you need to speak up, ensure that you're getting the treatment that's best for you. Now, you spoke a little bit about drug addiction and that you use that as a way to cope. Could you tell us a little bit about that and where that started? Like, what's the first time you used? How did that become an option for you? Let me know how that, I'm curious about that.
I think, it was one of those things that was unintentional, and it's really hard for me to map out specifically because of the mental state I was in. I do remember, it started with pills, because I was looking for anything to try to silence the voices. I was looking for anything to try to get some moments of clarity. And unfortunately, the downside to a lot of substances is they would give me that just briefly, and so I would chase that ongoing, and it would only lead to worse and worse outcomes later on. But it would give me brief moments of quiet or clarity, or what I thought was clarity at the time. And so it went from pills to just anything I could get access to. I mostly used stimulants because I was paranoid and I didn't want to sleep. The problem with not sleeping and having a psychotic disorder like schizophrenia is that it increases the hallucinations, the delusions, the paranoia. So I started basically going through a cycle of not sleeping, having heightened symptoms, and then falling back into using again. And it would be ongoing because I would need to stay awake. I was afraid if I went to sleep, I would be either locked up or, they would come and get me and put me in a psychiatric facility. And so I was terrified to tell anyone about what I was going through, but I was really afraid to go to sleep or be sedated at all. So, I fell right into addiction, and basically it was anything and everything I could get. And unfortunately, access to drugs is sometimes easier than access to actual treatment and medication in our country, and specific areas like the area I lived in, that's very much the case. And so it was just, it was my go-to, just anything to try to cope with what I was dealing with. So self-medicating became the only way I knew how to deal with the symptoms that I was experiencing.
And were you at school, in school at the time, or have a job, or how did you sustain that during this time?
Yeah, so while I was struggling with addiction before I was incarcerated, I was trying to go to school full time and work full time overnights. And
Wow.
obviously that didn't maintain. I lost the job first, and I was unfortunately had to drop out of college after that because I just couldn't keep up with, my actual life when I'm constantly delusional. And I think my wife is trying to poison me, and I think people are trying to put me in a psychiatric facility, and so it became just impossible to function day to day. And so my life became full-blown addiction, and eventually being incarcerated before I was able to get access to any help or any treatment.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about being arrested and being put in jail. And you say incarcerated. Are there different terms that people would use depending on what happened and like, were you in jail? Were you in prison? I know there are differences there. I don't know if you know all
Yeah.
those differences, but
Oh
can you tell
yeah,
us a little bit
yeah.
about that? Mm-hmm.
I say incarcerated because it's the more general term for it. And in my advocacy work, I've found that people find it to be more of a professional term. So instead of saying I've been to jail or I've been to prison, I
Mm-hmm.
found people are able to swallow incarcerated a little bit more. It gives off more
Interesting.
of a reformed vibe, I think. So that's why I use it. Not for any specific like terminology reason. I've just noticed that people are able to understand my journey a little bit better if I say incarcerated. I think it reaches people in a different way. So basically, what happened with me was because of my addiction, I was in a accident while driving. So while delusional, while using, I was driving, and unfortunately was in an accident with another vehicle where someone was injured. So it was a very serious ordeal. It took a couple of years before I was even charged with anything, before I was officially, incarcerated. And it was kind of during that time that I was trying to get, sober and
Mm.
trying to really look for options for what was clearly, something that was wrong with me. Unfortunately, it wasn't until after my time that I was in jail that I was able to get medication and treatment. I did reach out while I was incarcerated and ask, is there any way for me to talk to someone to get help? And I was met with a lot of, people, not only jailers basically saying no, but I was met with a lot of other inmates advising me that that was a bad idea because the facilities in jails and prisons tend to be really poor in America. And they tend to
Yeah.
be actually like people will avoid them to the point where it was frightening to me because I was like telling people what I was going through, and they're like, well, don't let the COs know because the facilities they'll put you in are way worse than the facilities you're currently in. And so it really
Yeah.
it made me scared enough that, I stopped reaching out. I stopped asking for help after a few times of, the correctional officers basically telling me, no, you're an addict. You're clearly looking to go in and like try to get some sort of medication. So they just kept shooting me down. And finally, after hearing that and then hearing the reaction of the other inmates, I was like, okay, well, this probably is something I should avoid. So it was going through the criminal justice system undiagnosed is a real pain because, a lot of this would have played a role in my sentencing and all that, but I wasn't diagnosed until a year after I was released. So it's difficult looking back because, if I had that diagnosis, if I had reached out for treatment sooner, maybe some of that could have been avoided. But it's also, unfortunately, super common in our current justice system. I would say a
Yes.
majority of the people that I met while I was in jail were people who were either struggling with addiction or struggling with an untreated mental illness. I would argue that probably makes up a large majority of our jails and prisons in the United States right now.
Oh, I 100% agree. And like to your point, the treatment options are terrible.
Yeah.
And I've heard from some of my patients in the past too that the mental health institutions that are associated with the prisons, right? So, like, if you are found not guilty by reason of insanity, which we should probably change the verbiage on that too. That's like something else we should probably advocate for changing.
Yeah.
But if you're found that you know the reason you committed the crime was because of mental illness, those facilities are often worse than the
Hmm.
prisons themselves and scarier, some people say. So yeah, I agree with you there that there does, because that was kind of my next question, I guess, was prison as scary as I imagine it being? As
Uh,
someone who hasn't been to prison, I'm like, I mean, I used to volunteer at essentially like a underage prison. You know, it was like a
yeah.
camp, is what they called it.
Hmm.
But even that was a little, you know, shocking to like a rural middle of Washington girl.
I would say that I anticipated it being a lot worse. I also think that my mental illness played a factor in my experience while I was incarcerated because people did look out for me. Like I was unwell.
Mm.
I was talking to myself. I was talking to people who weren't there. The other inmates knew that something was wrong with me. And in a way, they kind of looked out for me to make sure, because like I said, a lot of people told me, they're like, you don't want to go to one of these facilities. You don't want to be, you don't want to be diagnosed while you're here. And so they would actually help me if the correctional officers were coming around and I wasn't doing well. They would make sure that like I was, out of the way, or I wasn't being, confrontational or anything in that way. And it's hard for me to remember because I was still at the time fairly delusional. I was untreated. I was experiencing hallucinations daily. And so fortunately, I don't remember a lot of that time of my life.
Mm-hmm.
I do remember thinking that it wasn't as bad as I anticipated it being, mostly because I think, people were, they kind of helped me out and people looked out for me, especially in like my cell block. And so that definitely, I think, made my experience. I also live in Wisconsin, and I don't know that our jails and prisons are as bad as I've heard in some states. So I
Yeah.
think that also, plays a role in it. But the biggest factor was that while I was there, I realized, and looking back, most of the people there struggled with similar issues, whether they were diagnosed, not diagnosed, whether they, were actively seeking help for addiction or alcoholism. Like it was a lot of people going through similar issues. And so like, jail is where I actually discovered peer support groups. So I started going to
Oh.
AA in jail. And although I never really considered myself a person with an issue with alcohol, I went just to get out of the cell block, and that
Mm-hmm.
it was there that I started hearing other people's stories. And I reached out to go to NA, and I started going to NAMI peer support groups when I got out of jail. And so it was kind of that introduction to it while I was incarcerated, and being able to hear other people's struggles with, addiction or alcoholism or mental illness, that helped me identify that, one, I wasn't alone, and two, that, there were people that were suffering, not just struggling, but suffering because of not being able to get treatment, not being able to get sober. And that really helped me realize that I had to reach out for help. And so as soon as I was released, I did reach out to my wife and mom. And fortunately, because they are amazing people, and my mom had been through the system before, as soon as I reached out for help, they had doctors, psychiatrists, they had everything lined up and ready to go for me, local peer support groups, which again is why I think my treatment and diagnosis were so streamlined. Everything was ready to go. And it's also the most common question I get from people is, what do I do if a friend or family member is, struggling and they don't realize it? Most common
Mm-hmm.
question I get either at speaking events or online. And that's usually what I recommend, is be there for them. Understand that, people are, if they're really struggling and they don't know something's wrong with them, it might just take, a while for them to have those moments of clarity to be able to accept the help. And then when they do, just make sure you have those resources ready.
Yeah, no, and I get that question a lot too, which I always tell people. I'm
Yep.
like, it just reminds me of the good in our world, because
Mm-hmm.
there's, for every person who's suffering, there are multiple people out there wondering how they can help them. And it's wonderful that you had your wife and your mom ready to kind of assist once you got out. Like, how do we get you help? Because how long were you incarcerated for? You said 2 years to be actually, were
A
they
little
holding you
under a
there? Or were
year.
you, okay.
No, I was a little under a year. So it was a period of time where like, uh, I kind of transitioned because it took a while for me to get sentenced. It was like time served and everything like that was added to my sentence. So it was a little bit different how my sentencing and trial and everything went. So because of that, yeah, it was a period of time where like I unfortunately didn't really have access to talk to my mom or my wife about my symptoms a lot. About, I was like I said, it was while I was in jail that I realized I needed help. It wasn't until after I was released that I finally was able to tell them that I was ready to get that help. So it was a really difficult period because it was that time where, I was still delusional. I was still hallucinating, but I recognized there was an issue. And not all the time, just like I said, moments of clarity,
Yeah, it would
just
come and
little
go.
pieces.
Yeah.
Yep. Little pieces here and there. Oh, I definitely, I'm fine. I don't need help, to something is very wrong with me. And I don't know what it is, but I need to reach out. So it was, during that time that I got to really reflect and realize that there was an underlying issue that needed to be treated.
Yeah. And kind of off of that, tell me a little bit about your wife, because I was interviewing Gabe Howard on my podcast last month, and he mentioned something that I think is kind of important to bring up here as well. He said that he got his diagnosis of bipolar disorder when he was younger, and he thought he had to be locked up in a facility. He thought his life was over. He was like, I don't know how I even move forward from this. And then he went to this support group, and a woman showed up who was like in her 40s, married, had kids, they had a house. She mentioned like the stress of all of this and that she could feel herself ramping up. And that's the reason she'd come that night. And I honestly think she was there so that Gabe could hear her, because he never thought he could have a life. And so here you are, you have a wife, you have a loving relationship, you own a home, you're an advocate, you do all these things. Tell me a little bit about your wife and how you met her and how she's sustained through all that we've just talked about.
Yeah, a lot of people, in social media, when I got started, I didn't want to put my wife in a spotlight because, it was my journey I was taking, and I didn't want her to feel like she had to be shown on all my videos.
And she's
all my
also
content.
more shy than you.
She is. She's
now
very
that I've met
shy.
her, I'm like, she's not the one to be like, hey,
Yeah. So it's really interesting. I'm really grateful for her, because what a lot of people don't know is Allison and I started dating my senior year of high school. So she was my high school sweetheart, and so it was almost a year and a half that we were together before I started having symptoms. And so we had already been in a relationship. We had already decided, we wanted to keep, stay together, and we had a lot of these big talks. And then one day she had a boyfriend who was delusional and all of a sudden struggling with addiction. And so for her to stick through all of this, I always talk about how much it means that she's in my life, because at any point someone else would have left, at any point during that, whether it was the untreated mental illness, whether it was the addiction or the incarceration, there was plenty of windows where I think other people would have left, and in maybe different relationships and different situations that would have been a good thing to do too. I think I don't want to take what my wife went through for granted and say that it was in her best interest, because things are great for us now, but there was a point where she went through a lot dealing with my symptoms, and the accident I was in was actually in her car, and so there was a lot of points where she had no idea things were going to get better. There was no reason for her to believe that. There was no reason for her to believe we would have what we have today, the stability, the amazing jobs we get to do, and there was no sign of that when it all started. So for her to stick through all of it, that's why she is such a big part of my story. That's why I try to mention her as much as possible without her getting the irritation of the spotlight on her. But yeah, she played such a big role in my recovery. And like I said, she never at a single point tried to force me into treatment or anything. She just made it very clear she was worried about me. She was there if I was ready to receive help. And I think that's what helped me get that clarity and finally reach out to her to be like, hey, I am ready. And, you told me if I felt like I needed help to talk to you. And so her and my mom were always there through that. And it was a difficult time for both of them. My mom, for her own reasons, having been through what I was going through, that was an experience, a totally different experience for her. But for both of them to be there and be around and be ready for me when I did reach out was huge.
Yeah, I can't even imagine. I think that's kind of the struggle for a lot of people, is not having that support. Or
Yep.
I've even had patients who push the support away, right? Like someone tries to help them, and I've had patients get divorced, leave people because they're like, I'm just going to hold you back. I'm fucking things up for you. I'm so sorry,
Yep.
But the one thing I do know is, as humans, the thing that we cannot live without, obviously like air, water, food, but like people in connection, that connection is actually the most healing thing for us. So yeah, thank God for Allison. And your mama.
Yeah, seriously.
Yeah. So just to wrap things up, because now you're a mental health advocate, you speak all over the place, you create amazing content online. What got you into advocacy work? Do you feel like you kind of just fell into it? Do you think it was a conscious decision? Tell me a little bit about how that happened.
Yeah, it was definitely something that I didn't intend on doing. So I started doing peer support groups, like I said, and I knew that I wanted to continue to share. I knew that I wanted to continue to share my story. I just didn't know on what level or what capacity. And so I started with just peer support groups, telling people about what I had been through. And it was a few years after I started doing really well, and my medication was working. I was getting to a point of stability. I was back at school, and it was a year or two before COVID hit. And so I was deciding that, I wanted to reach more people with my story. And so my wife started watching TikTok, and I was like, this is the stupidest app I've ever seen. I'm never going to upload anything on here. And and then I downloaded it just to watch the videos she sent me, is what I told myself. And eventually I started posting videos. And after a couple of weeks of posting just like stupid actual TikTok-y type videos, like lip syncing and stuff like that, I was like, I want to post a story on here. So I posted what I call a Schizophrenic Storytime. It's one of my most popular segments to this day. And that first video, I went to sleep with 300 followers and woke up with 10,000. And from there, so from there, I realized not only how needed my advocacy was about schizophrenia, but, because of the comments and stuff that I was getting, I could tell that it was really misunderstood still, and there was a lot of stigma that surrounded the illness yet. And it just kind of took off from there, where because I was, from what people have told me, the way I do my story times and the way I articulate schizophrenia is something that, and I know from experience of working with peers, is something that a lot of people with schizophrenia aren't able to communicate or articulate, especially if they went undiagnosed for a long time, like we were talking about with my mom. That the cognitive effect it can have on you long term. I really felt like a voice for the voiceless, and like I was able to get to a point of stability for a reason, so I felt almost an obligation to share my story, not just for me, but, for my mom and for all of the peers and patients I met that either, would never get to a point of stability that they could share their story, or unfortunately pass away from addiction or, self-harm. So it was, it became almost something I felt compelled to do, and like I didn't have a choice anymore. Like it was just, this is what I do now. I was very fortunate that it took off in the way it did, so that I could do motivational speaking and content full time and be able to maximize the amount of people that heard my story. And I think the biggest thing was trying to be the voice I needed when I was first diagnosed, and be there so that if someone is experiencing these symptoms for the first time, or just getting a diagnosis, that they realize, that life isn't over. Schizophrenia diagnosis isn't a death sentence. Like you had mentioned with Gabe, I didn't really have that. I didn't really know that there was anything past my diagnosis because I had only ever seen my mom struggle with it, or, TV shows, movies, media that poorly portrayed schizophrenia. And so I didn't really have that. I just continued fighting. And so I wanted to be that voice for someone else.
Yeah, and I love that because I think, unfortunately, people who, well, in our treatment, right, depends on where you're at in the world, depends on your access to care, but even just your age. I mean, we could go back to how long schizophrenia has even been understood or treatable, and medications coming along that aren't just like, or lobotomies, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of us forget like how young the psychology field really is when it comes to treatments. And so I love that you do what you do. I love that you speak up and put a face and a story and a voice to the people who can't always do it themselves, or people who are too scared because of the stigma, thinking that, well, if I tell people, then people are going to assume X, Y, or Z about me, and that's going to hold me back. And I think it's really important, even like to go back to Gabe's story, you could be that person for someone else. And if they showed up, or if they're looking for information, if they think they have it, or they just got diagnosed, if they search it, I hope they find your content. And they're like, look, I could have a full life. I just, I need to figure out something that works for me, manage my own symptoms so that I feel my best, and I can do whatever I want. Sky's the limit. I love that you're taking the time to create that kind of content. I think it's really important.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. I think in general, my hope for this stuff is like to have conversations about topics and diagnoses and all sorts of different things that people don't want to talk about, that people are scared to talk about, because we often stigmatize certain things or make assumptions. And I think the more stories we can hear, the more we can see what it really is like, versus me just spouting DSM bullshit that like, it doesn't really tell you what it's like. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, and I think that's what, so when I started Advocacy, one of the things I still push for to this day is a lot of the speaking events I do, I talk about advocating using social media, because I don't want, advocacy to end with me or you. There's an entire generation of people who, have an opportunity to educate and advocate. And one day, me, you, people like Gabe Howard, we're not going to be here to advocate anymore. And so making sure that people are not only educated about mental illness, but enthusiastic about fighting for access to care and fighting for treatment and medication and getting resources for people is going to be crucial long term, because there's only so much older advocates can do. And not to call either of us older, but I'm about to hit 30, so I'm not one of the kids advocating anymore. And so I think it is important for that reason too, just making sure that people that are going to experience schizophrenia or experience being a caregiver with someone with severe mental illness also takes a step forward and shares their story, because every unique story can make a difference in how people perceive it or understand it.
Yeah, 100%. Are there any pieces that you think I missed? Anything you want to bring up that we could include that you think is important for people to understand? A misconception maybe I missed, or anything else?
The only thing I would love to touch base on is just there are a few misconceptions specifically about schizophrenia. One is that people with schizophrenia are in some way inherently violent, which, as you know, and hopefully most of the people listening know, is proven to just not be factual. It's actually more likely for someone with a serious mental illness to be the victim of violence than to commit violence. And so that's one thing that I got a lot when I was first diagnosed. People separated themselves or distanced themselves from me because they were all of the sudden terrified of my illness that I had been struggling with for years without a name, and so that's always, I think, one of the most frustrating things I see about schizophrenia. And then the second thing being that, we had talked about it a little bit here. Schizophrenia diagnosis is not a death sentence, and you can still live a very healthy, happy, and functional life with, medication and treatment. And so those are the two things I always try to emphasize when I talk about, my illness and what I've been through.
Yeah, and I do think that is important. That's dangerous piece. That's what pisses me off about media, is because they'll portray the mentally ill person is always dangerous. And that's why I liked at the beginning when you brought up about your mom being scared. And that's why I brought up the depression factor, is like, it's not, honestly, I would argue we're more dangerous to self when we have something like that, because we're so scared. Maybe we won't leave our home. We won't eat because we're afraid someone's poisoning us. Like, there's a lot of things that can happen that are actually more harmful to us. The likelihood of someone with a mental illness harming someone else, especially mental illness like schizophrenia, I forget the percentage. I want to say it was like 0.01%.
It's a small percentage.
Yeah. So I do think that is an important piece to mention too, because people always assume that. And then we're more isolated, which makes it worse.
Exactly.
Well, thank you for taking the time to talk with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
I hope you found that as insightful and helpful as I did. You can find Kody all over social media. His handle is Schizophrenic Hippie. I'll link it all in the description. Check him out. His stuff is really, really wonderful. Thanks again. Have a wonderful week, and I'll see you next time.